Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Talk to OBN, our weekly edition. Today we're going to discuss about America's interference in Ethiopian sovereign internal affairs these days. Obviously, the USA under Biden's administration showing dissatisfaction on the ongoing reform, which is headed by Dr. Abiy Ahmed. And today I joined by Dr. Brahanu Lenjiso from Prime Media, General Director of Prime Media, and Daniel Asafa, Legal Advisor of Oromia Regional States at the President Office. Good to have you. Okay, as I said, we're going to discuss about America's interference in Ethiopia's internal affairs these days. Let us begin with the historic relationship between America and Ethiopia. Can you highlight us, Doctor?
Well, thank you, Adisu. America and Ethiopia has a very long diplomatic relationship, about 120 years. I mean, obviously, they characterize, I don't know if all Ethiopian regimes do the same. Americans characterize it as a very good relationship, and of course it is a very long and full of ups and downs. Like any other country, America has these four core areas or focus areas in their diplomatic relationship. So that also works for Ethiopia, that the two countries work on protecting American citizens, on building democratic institutions, on economic development and stabilizing the Horn over the last almost 1 century. So that being said, I mean, having this very long relationship or bilateral relationship, it wasn't really that smooth. For one thing, because there was change of regimes in Ethiopia, so the relationship depends on the type of regimes that we have in the country. But even having regimes with different ideologies, America betrayed Ethiopian regimes a couple of times. They betrayed the imperial regime. They betrayed Mengistu, obviously, because he's socialist. And probably they have the strongest support for TPLF. They have been a very good ally of TPLF, starting from their guerrilla years, that they have supported them to come to power. I mean, CIA and the Secretary of African Affairs, Herman Cohen, was a key person in bringing TPLF to power and actually in deciding the referendum of Eritrea. And they also extended a very strong and cozy kind of support to TPLF over the last 27 years. Even when the Ethiopian public were protesting, outrageously protesting this regime, they were very, very consistent in supporting them. So now, fortunate for us, maybe unfortunate for them, the TPLF is gone.
TPLF is ousted.
Yes, and that is, I think, the main problem. The main problem of America started from there. TPLF is their big investment. They invested a lot on TPLF, and losing TPLF is not an easy thing for them.
They're crying over the mourn of TPLF, and it's too late to support anyway.
Obviously.
Okay, the second question, it goes to Mr. Daniel. Okay, what does the current hostility of America to the incumbent leadership signifies, as your knowledge concerns?
Okay, generally speaking, we can, I think Dr. Brown has given us a good context within which we have to see the Ethio-American relationship. The Ethiopian state, and especially in its modern conception of diplomacy, the diplomatic relationship between the Ethiopian state and the American state has been full of ups and downs that Brown has been mentioning. It is pretty much dependent on ideological orientation of the governments that are leading the states. Both of them, I mean. For instance, if you see trend through which the American government has been treating Ethiopia and other developing countries mainly, there is this difference between the Republicans whenever the government in US is Republican, from Republican Party, from Democratic Party, and this has to be taken seriously, I think. Much of this hostile kind of relationship with developing country governments are mostly registered during democratic governments. That does not mean the mere fact that the current US government is from Democratic Party is the reason why this hostility is emanating. This hostility is emanating from a couple of things. I think we can refer them. The first one is the external factors. The external factors mean, generally speaking, diplomacy is what countries use to do in order to get their interests secured all over the world. This has to be taken as an underlying definition. So since diplomacy is things that you do to secure your interest, the external factor is the interest with which US is coming to Ethiopia. That is one of the reasons for this current diplomatic role in which this kind of frictious relationship is being seen. I think this is a major point of departure, considering the history of US-Ethiopian state diplomatic relationship. What these external factors are depends on the interest of the US. The US has pretty much clear interests around here, especially from the perspective of the geopolitical significance of Horn of Africa region, because it is nearby to one of the major trade routes in the world, the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So the Horn of Africa, or Northeast Africa in general, starting from Egypt down to Somalia, or even more, Kenya, they are very much interested. The issue of peace and security around here matters a lot to them, because otherwise they cannot easily trade. The West in general cannot easily trade with East. This is a major route. So the kind of government that they want around here is clear, and that is one of the major point of departure that are causing these diplomatic roles, I think. And the second one is
that means they're looking for a puppet government, or
that's obvious.
Yeah,
I'm not very much interested in the kind of leadership that has the courage and the self-esteem to go his own way. So this has been a trend, actually, and obviously many of the problems has been emanating from having a government that secures their interest or that wants to go his own way. That does not mean Dr. Abiy's government is going against US interest. It's not the case, I think. What they want is they want to dictate. That's the obvious trends of superpowers in the world, I think. That's what they want.
Good job, Doctor. What does current hostility? Okay, you want to finish? Okay, sure.
You give me 1 minute.
All right.
And the second problem of this diplomatic role is the internal part. Now, this has to be very seriously taken by our government too. The first one is, maybe Dr. Brown can go in detail into it. there is this institutional failure. Our diplomatic institutions has, I mean, they used to be weak, but this time they are getting weaker. And I think one of the reform agendas of this transition has to be, actually, as per the information I have, a serious reform is undergoing around Ministry of Foreign Affairs in general, including our diplomats in our embassies overseas, which are mandated to undergo this diplomatic role of or work of the country. So this failed because, you know, these institutions has never been doing their job. They were not telling our truths, our stories to the world. That's a major problem. The US has been dependent on its own apparatus to understand Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. And the Ethiopian embassy in US has never done anything to my knowledge, at least, to make the US government aware of what's going on in Ethiopia. Mm. And the same goes to every embassy in the world. Mm. They were, I don't think they were even clear because they were even clear with what's going on in the country, let alone telling our story. Because as a diplomatic mission to any country, our embassies are representatives of our heads of state. So are we really establishing that kind of institutional linkage for information exchange and for our outreach to these countries? I really doubt. The same goes with other diplomacy tracks, like people-to-people diplomacy, economic diplomacy, media, government,
public advocacy,
public activism part. All this, if you see, are fully occupied by violent communications, which is against diplomacy. So the current role, even though it emanates from the external factors that I've been mentioning, it is being exacerbated by this internal failures.
Great job. Okay, what does the current hostility of America to the incumbent leadership signifies, as your knowledge concerns, Doctor?
Yeah, thank you. I think Daniel mentioned it, but before we come to this particular current hostility, I think it is also very important for us to have that bigger picture of the two countries' interest. As I said, the bilateral relationship between the two countries basically focus on four things. The first one is protection of citizens, especially protection of American citizens. The second one is strengthening democracy and institutional building. The third one is economic development, and the fourth one is stabilizing the region. So Ethiopia is the best ally of the United States of America when it comes to stabilizing the region. So at least in principle, they have to look at these four things. Are Ethiopians protecting the American citizens? Are Ethiopians progressing very well in democratization process, in institutional building? Are Ethiopians doing good on economic development? Are Ethiopians doing good in stabilizing the regions? They have to ask these four questions as a key to assess their diplomatic relations. Whether they are doing that or not is another question, but hostility, I think, is at the very heart of America's relation with any country in the world. They are hostile to any country, especially if they don't get what they want. They will be definitely hostile. But we can mention at least two key factors to this current hostility of the United States of America towards Ethiopia. The first one is the TPLF factor. As I said, TPLF were their big investment. It is not only that America invested a lot on TPLF and that they don't want to lose that. The TPLF are also very good at manipulating the West. They did that for half a century. They manipulated the international community by, for example, marching the famine victim in 1984. They marched about 200,000 Tigrayans to Sudan to attract the global attention. They generated huge funds that they used to buy weaponry. They bombed, school kids to get international attention. And they have also manipulated this current military conflict in Tigray very well. They did manipulate it to we are seeing it like the international community is beating their drums. So that's one thing. The TPLF outplayed the Ethiopian government when it comes to manipulating the international community. The second factor is the fear of a strong government factor, that America doesn't want to see a strong leader in the continent because they have their own interest. They want the African continent to be the way it is, especially the Horn. So I don't think Abiy Ahmed is the type of leader they want to see in the region. Diplomatically speaking, he's not someone who rejects them, that they can easily come after him and remove him, or he's not someone who accepts everything they say. So he's a different guy for them. That created some sort of fear, I think, in Americans. And this conflict in Tigray, the military operation in Tigray, gave them a very good opportunity for them to assess this scenario. If things were moving the way it started, like the Ethiopian public, support and goes behind Abiy the way they started, it would have been very difficult for them to go completely against the interest of the public. But they get this opportunity that the conflict in Tigray gives them an intervention point. And on that intervention point, as Danny said, the communication generally, communication about the reform going on in the country, communication about the armed conflict in Tigray itself was non-existent. So the TPLF were playing on free field, that the international community listen only to them because we are not doing what we were supposed to do. So this thing is added up and gave America the chance to show hostility, not to make hostile, they are already hostile, but to express their hostility publicly. But again, it is not new or unique to Ethiopia. The solution is in our hand. The first thing we need to do is we have to take responsibility for what is happening in this country. It shouldn't be America who take responsibility for the humanitarian crisis that we have in this country. It shouldn't be the America that is always the guardians of human rights. We can. We are human beings. These are our brothers and sisters. Whenever there is crisis, we have to take responsibility. We have to resolve it as quickly as possible. Then we don't need interference. And nobody asks for it if there is no problem. We have to do that internally, and we have to communicate ourselves externally. I don't know if diplomacy has the same meaning that it has in the rest of the world in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a a weirdly unique country. The way we do things is very weird, and we sometimes take pride in it. And I mean, we are not good at it. There are a lot of things that we should improve when it comes to diplomacy. It shouldn't be symbolic. I mean, okay, you can do symbolic, you can do cultural diplomacy, but you shouldn't do cultural diplomacy always. We shouldn't go to, I mean, UK only to show the type of dress we have in Ethiopia. We have to do better than that. We have to communicate our interests, because diplomacy, after all, is cultivating your own interest in foreign countries. What is our interest in the US, for example? Do we have a clear picture? At least informing the US government about what is happening in Ethiopia should be number one, because US anyway is a superpower. They have the capacity to help you. I mean, they can help you if they like you, and they also have the capacity to, you know, destroy you. So at least our diplomacy should improve on those areas, and we need to have a clear picture of what we need in every country that we have a diplomatic mission in. Otherwise, it is going to be tough, because this is an information era. This is a communication era. You have to communicate well, and we again have two problems at least. The first one is we are not colonized. We are happy about that, but we are also disconnected. I mean, colony generally could be bad, but there are certain good things that colony brought. It brought the countries closer. I mean, the colonized African countries, for example, they know better than us how to talk to the West. I do not mean we should be colonized to talk to the West, but we can learn. We shouldn't do everything in a very weird and a unique way.
For the sake of pride only.
Yes.
Good job.
We need to sell our stories, and we are weak on that.
Okay, Mr. Daniel, how do you see the sanction declared by Biden's administration over Ethiopia?
Before that, let me add one thing.
Good job.
The cultural aspect of Ethiopia. After he told me, I was watching this interview, a kind of panel has been prepared by US Peace Institute. And it was conducted, I think, 1.5 years ago, and they invited 4 former US ambassadors to Ethiopia. You know, they have this consistent view of us. Our understanding of diplomacy is very weak. And you know, one thing that 4 of them said was, Ethiopians don't tell you they rejected your idea. What they do is, let me sleep on it and let me talk to my boss, let me talk to Nkele, which means that is the other way of saying no to your question, to your request. This is bad, really, in diplomacy. And the second one is our uncompromising culture. Sheen, I think it was David Sheen, that was dividing the country into the highland and the lowland. And they understand that to this level. Whenever
and I remember one of his statements on that panel discussions that they asked him, what do you think, tell us the one thing that you think was important to make you a better diplomat in Ethiopia. And he said Ethiopians, especially Ethiopians in the north, they don't compromise. There is nothing called compromise in their wallet. Had I known that, I could have been a better diplomat.
That's the worst thing. The worst culture, or the worst kind of habits that one has to have if you have to develop it's the diplomatic culture or diplomatic engagement. So this too by itself is manifesting itself even today, and this has to be taken seriously by the Ethiopian government and by everybody in every diplomatic tracks. As I've told you, diplomacy is not only a job of government as it was known traditionally. These days, the people what the people of Ethiopia are doing in people of Ethiopia living in US are doing by itself is a diplomacy. It makes the US government understand who we are, what we are doing, what interests we have. Are we with what is going on, or are we against what's going on? All these things. This is a people-to-people diplomacy. They call it. Oh, activism. What do Ethiopian intellectuals say about this? It by itself is diplomacy. So every aspect of us through which we use to communicate, it could be through research, it could be through activism, as I will be mentioning, media, all these things speaks about what is our stand, what is our view of them. It tells all this. So in diplomacy, one of the major instruments is the use of non-violent communication. Your communication in diplomacy, as its name implies, has to always be non-violent. It should not be more agitating, it should not be uncompromising, it should not be repelling. It has to be attractive. It has to try to make people, it has to try to make states, countries, everyone onto the table. So these are what we lack generally. To add to the weirdly different aspect of Ethiopians, which is adding to the complication. Coming to the current sanction, the visa restriction and the majorly economic aid cuts, especially in relation to security, except for some basic assistance like education, social service assistance, democratization, human rights. So, there is this aspect in U.S. diplomacy, as Dr. Brown has been trying to mention. U.S. is always violent, and they consider it as one aspect of diplomatic relationship. By the sanction by itself is diplomatic for them. They don't consider it as a violence. They don't consider it as a kind of severing one's relationship with Ethiopia. They are considering it. They are doing it to get what they want from it. That is what economists call fiscal waterboarding. A kind of they waterboard you in shortage of finance because they know they made you dependent on their funding. The donor funding is for many developing countries, obviously one of the major areas wherein the dependency between the developing and the developed has been established. So whenever they do this, they are trying to get what they want, what they couldn't get through mediation, what they couldn't get through negotiation. They've been trying. So due to the fact that they couldn't get what they want through that means they are using that, they are plugging this card in order to get. But there is one thing that I'm always concerned with, and that has to be, I think, has to be taken as an opportunity. The Ethiopian government. There is this book written by David Hancock, Graham Hancock. Yeah, for Lords of Poverty, you call them. Corruption in international aid business, to call it. You know, this aid relationship has always been used as an instrument making lords of poverty in developing countries. It has, whenever they say that it is a rent, actually. A rent for incumbent governments to distribute rather than working, toiling, building its own nation so that the people, the nation will exploit the resource it has and progress towards development.
It's a bill paid for his loyalty.
Yes. So there are some countries that have been using it as an opportunity or as a springboard towards development. That does not mean we can easily reject the U.S. interest and develop at least. especially whenever you are going against them. What I'm saying here is, I don't want to go to detail because in the interest of time. What I'm saying is, we have to learn two things. The first thing is we have to know our limitation, the limitation that we have been mentioned, so that we have to work on it. Some of what we're doing is somehow undiplomatic. You can't even if it is not US, let alone such kind of big superpower country that can do anything for you. It's not good even to do to some junior country. The best way to preserve your interest internationally is to have a good kind of cooperative relationship with them. But for fear of such kind of sanction, you have it doesn't mean you have to compromise everything. That's not going to happen. That's not how it works, actually.
It shouldn't be done at the expense of sovereign interest.
Yeah, even there is this element of sovereignty.
Exactly.
Even though it is somehow, it can somehow be compromised due to different major developments, especially compared to early consumption. But what I'm saying is, or message that I want to deliver is like, we have to strike the balance between our interest. Sometimes some of what we used to do is against our interest sometimes. For instance, we have been advocating as one of the agendas of this transition, we have been advocating national consensus as one major instrument to resolve many of deep-rooted historical problems in this country. This is our agenda. This couldn't be an agenda that's going to be imposed by US on us, because it has already been our agenda.
Exactly.
We framed it. So we have to discreetly figure out what they're saying, what they're demanding from us, and what really are our interests. If there is an overlap, it shouldn't be a point of contention. That has to be a point of cooperation rather.
TPLF got ousted and no more on power now. And why America felt somber?
Well, I don't know if every American knows that. One of my friends was joking yesterday on Facebook that one of the senators think that TPLF is still in power. Yeah. I don't think it is particularly about TPLF. Although, as I said, they have invested a lot in them and they don't want to lose them. America is a very sharp country when it comes to cultivating her own interest. So it is very much about looking for the next alternative. So they compare their interests against what we have in Ethiopia right now. For that matter, as I said earlier, America has this fear of a strong leader in Africa in general and in Ethiopia in particular, because Ethiopia is their best ally, especially in the Horn. So they have this very big interest in the region, and they always look for someone who can help them to get what they want. Look, in the 1980s, when the TPLF were in the bush, they have this freelance journalist who has been working in the Horn for the whole decade. Her name is Grace Smith, and she was a very close friend of Mallas, and she was settling with Mallas and the CIA, and she facilitated all those things to bring them to power. So US is not doing this for fun. They have interest. They wanted to cultivate that interest by keeping someone who is loyal to them in power. Now, you see this statement is coming that the Ethiopian government has to negotiate with TPLF. but the Ethiopian government is very clear that they cannot negotiate with TPLF anymore because they are terrorists, and some of their senators are coming out repeating that same statement, that they are terrorists and the Ethiopian government shouldn't negotiate with them. So what is US doing now? Why US is imposing these sanctions that you raised? Why US is cutting aid from Ethiopia? It is like bargaining, right? So US has interest, they want to get something. They know that they can't get TPLF back on power. So what is the second option? The second option is to make this government weak. Yeah, they want to make this government weak and work for them. Or they have to look for a new government that serves their interest. In doing that, they have this series of steps. That first, for example, they impose a visa restriction. It is like, okay, if you don't do this for me, I am not going to give you visa, so you cannot come to my country. Okay, if the leaders panic, for example, they have to fulfill their interest to get visa. If they reject, for example, as we hear, then what is the second step? The second step is probably to, they started already cutting aids. They probably continue to cut aid. They are going to, I think, impose some trade restrictions, military trade restrictions, stuff like that. Why they are doing all this? Because they have interest. They wanted to get that interest from this country. So, but there is another version to all this story, as Danny mentioned, especially the aid thing. Graham Hancock wrote long time ago about awareness of poverty, and it's
prestige and corruption in international aid.
International aid. He's an anthropologist, and he actually wrote it in a very, very beautiful way. That is okay. That's some people think that is fiction or whatever. Then this big economist came out of Africa, Damsa Moyo. She wrote about dead aid. And the fight, the war on Damsa Moyo was just too much. They almost removed her from the scene. This argument between Damsa and Jeffrey Sachs, who is actually a very, very close friend of Malala Zenawi, who say we have to inject resource, we have to add aid, we have to, inject more resources to poor countries and untap them from poverty. Well, Damsa said no. That is actually preparing these countries for more disaster. That creates dependency syndrome. If you take your aid away, then these African nations will look for their own option of coming out of poverty or escaping poverty. So, I know, I was in Europe, for example, in the beginning of 2010s, when all the economists, when all the development economists were paid to campaign against Damsa Moyo, to push Damsa Moyo from this conversation. Now the question is, who need aid? Is that the West or the developing countries? That's a big question. That's America went to give aid more than Ethiopia went to get aid. Why? Because America will use aid anyway to cultivate her interest in these foreign countries. On the flip side, we don't give aid to these Western countries, but we have interest that we are in a diplomatic relationship with them. And we are not even good at communicating ourselves. All we do for close to 1 century, we go to a given country, we tell them our story. Ethiopia is an uncolonized country. No, we have to do better. There is this saying from Winston Churchill that he said, diplomacy is the art of telling people go to hell in a way that they ask you for a direction. You know, you have to have that very convincing communication. Unfortunately, we don't have it in Ethiopia. I mean, I do not mean we don't have great diplomats. We have great diplomats. We still have great diplomats. But at an institutional level, there is a big crisis. Look, we don't speak English compared to any other country in the world. We, for obvious reason, we don't speak English. But there is another English for diplomacy. Now, look at us. We don't speak English. How can we speak diplomatic language to communicate to the rest of the world? So we have a long way to go. We need a very sharp training of our vision, for example. What is our common vision? What is our shared vision at country level? How can we communicate that to the rest of the world? How can we cultivate that interest in the rest of the world? What type of language, what type of statement is, like, for example, Danny said, we shouldn't use this violent language. Even in the country, we shouldn't use. We cannot be violent anymore. We have to be as diplomatic as possible, but we have to communicate our interest at the same time.
Dr. Brahanu Lengiso, Director General of Prime Media, and Mr. Daniel Asafa, Legal Advisor at the President Office of Oromia. Thank you for your scholarly, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
A pleasure.
Yeah.
Dear viewers, due to the interest of time, I would like to wrap up my discussion with scholars here. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye. This brings you the end of our edition today.